Hello, welcome everyone to the initial installment of the TJIA Roundtable, Explorations in International Relations. The theme of today's panel is social justice around the world. And to introduce us to this topic, we have three distinguished speakers. Carolyn Reed, who will be talking about Islamophobia in France. Morgan Waters, who will be talking about gender bias in Japan. And Darius White, who will be letting us know about the panic defense, which you will explain to us, in multiple countries around the world. And then they'll each say a little bit about their particular topics, and then we'll have a short conversation about what unites these seemingly disparate topics. And without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Carolyn Reed.
Hi. So my topic is on French President Emmanuel Macron's new proposed anti-terrorism legislation called the Charter of Republican Values. This is a highly controversial bill, and it was passed by France's National Assembly, which is their lower house of French Parliament, on February 15th, and is currently under review in the French Senate. Since France has the largest Muslim population in Europe and has been hit hard and frequently by Islamic terrorist attacks, it makes sense to implement more extensive anti-terrorism measures. However, the policies included in Macron's charter are less about preventing religious radicalization and more about increasing the marginalization of French Muslims. According to Macron, the charter is designed to promote Republican values. These are secular values, French values, anything that has to do with the Democratic Republic. And it is meant to fight against Islamist separatism. And Islamist separatism it's a made-up term that Macron came up with to scaremonger about Muslims. It's where religious communities within France that are prone to radicalization because of disenfranchisement and alienation. Some of the provisions in the charter include restricting homeschooling, which is premised on the notion that Muslim children will be less susceptible to radicalization if they receive a secular education, criminalizing online hate speech, because hate speech can potentially endanger the lives of individuals by inciting terrorist attacks, and strengthening government oversight of religious practice and associations. Strengthening government oversight is the most controversial provision because it is quasi-autocratic. It will force religious groups to declare foreign donations of 10,000 plus euros to the government and grant local authorities the power to shut down mosques accused of suspicious activities. But also, any club that applies for state subsidies will have to sign a contract promising to respect French Republican values. And this is to ensure that state funds are not financing terrorist activity. State efforts to control religious activity are directly in contradiction with French Republican values, because French Republican values promote religious freedom. And yeah.
Thank you, Carolyn. Very interesting and a controversial, unexpected development in French politics and history. To take us to the other side of the world now, Morgan Waters will now tell us about some issues in Japan that demand our attention. Morgan?
Yes. Japan is a rather advanced, technologically, economically, and technologically speaking country. It's very legally progressive when it comes to equal rights protections for minority groups when compared to other countries around the world. They have officially recognized multiple decrees, international decrees regarding equal rights, and sections of their constitution also recognize that their nation will not discriminate against people based on gender, religion, race, etc. However, despite certain laws and resources allocated to create a more significant level of change regarding gender bias within the country, Japanese society has still been unable to actually produce the changes necessary to protect and uplift women throughout the country. Within both the job sphere and the social realm, women are actively discriminated against via lack of job security, job promotion, unrealistic and negative understandings of their job skills, and most notably, I would say, sexual assault. with many women and girls not feeling comfortable enough with their society and its legal system to properly report when someone has assaulted them. Some say that this is because there is a high regard or high acknowledgement of a sense of silence throughout the country. And I think that transcends down through multiple realms of the society. So if somebody is being assaulted, the area, like on a train or in train stations, which is where that usually happens, they don't always have the confidence to speak up because they don't want to disrupt the type of peace atmosphere. And they also don't feel confident enough to go to the authorities to report it because historically the authorities haven't done well with handling these issues and often find themselves victim blaming. And then more recently in the job sphere, their government started a womenomics program, which was supposed to help women become more uplifted within their workspaces since they are often discriminated against. However, even though, again, they implement these things like in the Constitution, there still is no physical evidence that these things work. And a lot of the bias is rooted in just cultural understanding or thinking that women do not possess the skills necessary to be as successful as men in the workplace. And out of the women who are employed, most of them are employed part-time, and they eventually leave their jobs and retire early or leave their jobs to start families and are not expected to be able to do both of those things at the same time. So finally, I think that it's important to kind of study this issue because, since Japan is a rather advanced country, internationally speaking, I believe that these countries kind of set the standard for how women should be treated. So if a country sees that, someone or some nation that's doing as well as Japan is treating their women in this way, it's almost says it's okay for them to treat women even lesser because they're not as technologically or economically advanced as Japan is.
Thank you, Morgan. And for our third presentation, we have Darius White, who will be explaining to us the panic defense and in 3 different countries. Well, they're in 3. I don't know if I'm going to talk about them all. So, Darius, it's all you.
Okie dokie. So the LGBTQ Panic Defense was also known as like the gay or trans panic defense. So it's a legal strategy that asks the jury to find that a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity or expression is to blame for a defendant's violent reaction. It's used to mitigate cases of hate crime or murder to manslaughter or justified homicide. It's important to know like manslaughter and justified homicide are penalized much less severe than murder and hate crimes. So basically it kind of lessens their sentence, and justified homicide even absolves the actor of any criminal liability. The defense is used in 3 ways. The first is the defense of insanity or diminished capacity. And the defendant argues in that case that a sexual proposition from the LGBTQ plus victim triggered a nervous breakdown or panic in them, and it provoked them to attack them or commit violence. And the second way it's used in court is the defense of provocation, which argues that the sexual proposition provoked them and induced the defendant to kill the victim. And the third defense is a self-defense argument, and that pretty much argues that the victim was about to cause the defendant serious bodily harm, so they just defended themselves, supposedly. The strategy is only banned in 2 countries. New Zealand was the first. It was banned in 2009. And most recently, South Australia became the final Australian state to abolish the panic defense. And this happened in 2020. Here in the US, only 12 states banned the defense, and 12 states and DC. In 2013, the American Bar Association resolution urged that governments take legislative action to limit the defense. And ever since then, those 12 states and DC have banned them. And at the federal level, there are 2 bills called the Gay and Trans Panic Defense Prohibition Act of 2019. There's one in the Senate and one in the House of Representatives. They were struggling to make it out of the committee level during the Trump administration, but with the Biden administration, it looks more promising. Elsewhere in the world, the panic defense is used So I guess those other two examples were like positive examples with like, they were banned successfully. And I also want to talk about the panic defense in the Philippines and Jamaica. These countries, it is very extremely unlikely that the defense will be banned. So in the Philippines in 2014, I want to talk about a case with a US Marine who murdered Jennifer Laud after finding out that she was a transgender. Not only was the Marine sentence mitigated from murder to homicide, claiming diminished capacity, but also the Filipino president, Rodrigo Duterte, granted the Marine an absolute pardon after he only served a little more than half of his sentence. The success of the panic defense, lessening the Marine's charge, and Duterte's move to pardon him it can be like interpreted by like Filipinos and the international community that trans lives matter less, that the justice system is unequal, and that the panic defense is valid in their courts. And what he did basically just said to the world that he just validated the defense strategy. And in Jamaica, another place, homosexuality is criminalized. And there's this law, they're referred to as buggery laws, but officially known as the Offenses Against a Person Act of 1864, which were inherited from the British Crown during the colonial rule. They're not fully enforced technically under the law, but they're very symbolic of the widespread homophobia in the country. Like it's very emblematic of like the homophobic, the homophobic ideas that a lot of Jamaicans have. And under these laws, all gay men are essentially criminals from like a legal perspective. And this is really troubling considering that the panic defense is more likely to succeed from that standpoint. For example, like with the self-defense case, if you say that you're defending yourself from a criminal, like a gay man, it sounds more valid than if you were just arguing that, oh, I just was defending myself. So at its core, the LGBTQ plus panic defense is dehumanizing. It legitimizes homophobia in the court of law, and it dishonors a victim's right to justice. It's a flawed argument based on the prejudices of the judges and jury, and something that further marginalizes a community that already faces prosecution, discrimination, and violence around the world today. Ronald Brown from New Zealand, Andrew Neger from Australia, Nikki Kuhansen from Washington State, Jennifer Laud from the Philippines, and Dexter Pottinger from Jamaica. All these names were people that were dehumanized by their courts using the LGBTQ plus panic defense. Their courts won't recognize them, so I thought by sharing their names, I would. In conclusion, with the progress in the United States happening today to ban the defense, I hope that there will be increased cognizance about this issue nationally and internationally.
Thank you, Darius. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Karen. They're all excellent presentations. And as the listener can tell, very different themes, very different places. And yet there are some commonalities. And I just have a few questions, and I'm going to direct these questions to individual speakers, but I invite the others to chime in if and how they would like as well. And so my first question is for Morgan, who spoke about gender inequality and marginalization in Japan. And my question to Morgan is this: what does it mean to be invisible in the context of minorities?
Well, I'd say the most important aspect that affects minorities being invisible is their inability to receive the same treatment, resources, support as their visible counterparts. So in the context of women in Japan and women in other parts of the world, this means lack of proper investigation into assaults or into workplace bias, lack of support when it comes to reporting these types of things, lack of fair treatment in the workplace and in society, and the lack of proper enforcement of the protections afforded to them. Like I mentioned, the Constitution blatantly states that everybody should be treated equally. So if a government is unable to properly make sure that that's happening, physically happening in their society, it's not really worth stating. And of course, although this is not the worst treatment women can receive in the world, I think it's, like I stated again, I think it's up to the most advanced countries to kind of set the standards for equality and the uplifting of women and other gender, sexual, et cetera, minorities. Because, if we don't create a standard, then it's not going to be followed at all. So again, I think like invisibility just really means diminishing the importance of the issues and making sure that the people who are struggling the most, who are being oppressed the most, aren't receiving the same treatment, so that this cycle can continue.
Thank you, Morgan. Would either Darius or Carolyn like to add to what Morgan said?
I agree with you, Morgan. Invisibility is, I think, the silent killer of everyone, especially in the perpetuation of social injustices. And I think that it means, with invisibility, calling out injustices is the most important thing to do.
Darius?
Yeah, I also agree. The stories should be told, stories should be shared, and also names should be shared. Like a lot of stories are kind of talked about for a week, or like they're swept under the rug. But when those things are allowed to happen, people forget about it, and injustice happens more and more. But when one of the cases I was looking at for my part, Nikki Kuhn Hassen's mother, she was a vocal advocate for Nikki when she was murdered, and she did not let her daughter be invisible she did not let her death just happen and get swept under the rug. She was vocal on social media. She was at the protests outside of the courthouse. There was media attention for it all. And because of all because of all the visibility, first of all, they were able to pass Nikki's law, the Nikki Kuhn Hassen Act in 2020 in Washington. So just with the visibility, they literally putting her name in the act, it shows that like when you tell people's stories, when you say people's names, when you share, it can really have an effect. And it's exemplified by the act. And yeah, that's all.
All right. We all have something to say. And I expect you all have something to say about everything, but I'll still direct this one to Carolyn. And this question is, does labeling and stereotyping influence how we look at and understand the society, which for you, the society is France?
Yes, very much so. And labels and stereotypes are very harmful to any society. Just look at the vilification of Islam in France and all over the Western world. Islam is in and of itself just another Abrahamic religion, just like Christianity and just like Judaism. They all share one God. But despite this, the terrorist label has basically led millions of Muslims to be convicted of crimes they did not commit. And it's so unfair to do that to a society.
Would either Morgan or Darius like to say something about stereotyping within their societies? Morgan, Japan?
Yeah, I agree. I think that regarding women's rights, I think that by raising people in an environment where men are seen as superior to women, which I think is the case in most societies across the world, unfortunately, men are going to act accordingly and disregard the needs and wants of women, which will obviously disadvantage women as a whole. And this can be seen in Japan by men. They're doing studies and men literally thinking that women are incapable of doing the same things that men are. So of course, if somebody truly believes that, they're going to treat women in a certain way, which will inherently not allow them to kind of advance in their companies or in the government or in the job sector. And the same thing with the sexual assault experiences of women. A lot of them said that when it happened to them, it seemed as if it was normal for the man, like it was a casual occurrence, because to them, I guess women are seen as an object that can be used how they please, which is obviously not the case. But again, if you're raising people to think that that's okay, it's going to happen. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you kind of nip those stereotypes in the butt, I guess, because if you don't, then they'll just continue to fester and you'll continue to have these problems arise because people think that other people aren't as deserving of certain rights as they should be.
Yeah, I would agree with both you ladies. Stereotypes and labeling is very dangerous, especially when it can be interpreted into policy or into courts. So for my example, there's stereotypes that gay men or like LGBTQ community is predatory, or that they have AIDS or HIV, or just stereotypes like that are literally used with the panic defense. So for example, I said the self-defense was one of the strategies they use. So, it's them capitalizing off that predatory stereotype, like that the gay man was trying to, come on to somebody or something like that. But also, it was also used in another case in California. They said that he was self-defense because the person had AIDS. The person that was doing the proposition to the man, the defendant, they said that he had AIDS, but he didn't even know he had AIDS. Just because he knew after the fact he had AIDS, and they still used it as a defense. And they were saying that he was protecting himself from a disease or a bio or something like that. And then in the Jamaica example, like I said, gay men are literally labeled as criminals. So that's literally an example of, a stereotype, and then to the actual legally, you're labeled as a criminal. And also, I think it's important to be careful with headlines when people just say like, "Oh, a gay man was killed in this way." Like, I think that they need to use names more in headlines in the media as well, because if you just say their label, you're not giving them, you're dehumanizing the person. You're just saying their label. They're not a person. So I think that's also a big one with labeling and stereotyping.
Thank you, Darius, but you could keep your microphone on, because this question is for you. And it's a two-part question, and I'm not going to ask the first part because you guys have already answered it, because you're very efficient in your question answering. I'll ask the second part, and it's been in the back of my mind throughout everything you said, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to ask it, which is about power. What does power have to do with fairness and justice? And again, it's been kind of woven into what you all have been saying, but I'd like to hear all of you, if you could, but starting with Darius, speak directly to the issue of power shaping all of the forces that you've been describing. So, Darius?
Oh, I think the LGBTQ panic defense kind of was just brought about by the straight people who are the heteronormative people who are in power. So I think it's rooted in that heteronormativity. I was just going to mention my example with the Philippines and the United States Marine member, and I was going to talk about the power discrepancy between the Philippines and the U.S. So they have an agreement right now called the Visiting Forces Agreement, and it's the U.S. for they're visiting to the Philippines, and their agreement ensures that the two countries have a predetermined process to be followed if an American service member is arrested and charged for a crime. And so when Jennifer Laud was killed by the Marine member, and he was pardoned for that, the Filipinos kind of were reminded of the Status of Forces Agreement, which ended in 1991. So there's kind of similar. They're both agreements for Philippine-U.S. military relations. But during that era, in the Status of Forces Agreement era, there was widespread abuse and violence perpetrated by American military personnel against Filipino women and girls at or around bases. And with that agreement, it protected those criminals from prosecution in Filipino courts because it tried them instead by the U.S. military justice system. So when Duterte pardoned the Marine, it seemed to a lot of Filipinos that he was appeasing to the U.S. There's a lot of geopolitical tension with the South China Sea going on. There's a lot going on over there. I'm not going to speak on, but they were a lot of Filipinos felt like this was an affront to their sovereignty, that it was just them appeasing to the U.S.'s power, and it really shows these colonial vestiges are still having effects. But it's hard to have fairness and justice when the people in power do not recognize the implicit bias that they have, and that there is a lot of bias when you accept the LGBTQ plus panic defense, because it's I guess like building on the foundation of homophobia, and just, you know, it accepts homophobia as the what's right when it really shouldn't be that way. So it just allows for injustice because the people in power accept this argument, and the people in power are the heteronormative. So yeah.
Thank you, Darius. Carolyn?
I was going to agree with you. Power is a really important part of justice, and especially if you don't have it, then you will usually not have justice. Because without power, you do not have the capacity to fight back. And a lot of the time, minorities, like all of our topics today, like women, Muslims, and LGBTQ members, they all are within societies that do not recognize them as, you know, full human beings, much less citizens. And without power, how are they going to call out injustice? How are they going to fight against it?
Yeah, I agree with the both of you as well. And I think in regards to women's rights within Japan, a lot of the fixes that they've made are kind of band-aid issues because they're not dealing with the root of the problem, which is, you know, men in their society. And I think because men do hold the power in patriarchal societies, which Japan is a part of, you kind of don't want to upset a lot of the people who do inherently have that power, which is why I think that they do things like make women's only train cars, or start the Womenomics initiative in the government specifically, but still do not have a lot of women in governmental positions that could alter, you know, the status quo. So I think that because men still do hold so much power within their society, there is that issue of not really attacking the true issue, which is how men are unable to or do not want to realize how they themselves are affecting the lives of women. And I think in the case of each of the issues that we discussed, like Carolyn mentioned, like power isn't something that people want to give up. So unless enough people come together and enough men in Japan specifically realize that they are hurting a lot of women, there isn't going to be a lot of radical change until that does happen, unfortunately, in my opinion.
A lot to think about. I'm going to, if we left it there, it would be way too depressing. So I'm going to leave it in a probably still depressing place, which is really, we're not going to abolish power, right? Power is, and if what you all said is correct, that marginalization, the rendering of some segments of society as invisible, and mistreatment being a consequence of invisibility, all being attributes, natural accoutrement of power, then whoever has power is going to do this, right? But someone is always going to have power, right? Power just is, it's a relational concept. Someone's going to have power. And so if you guys are right, then we're always going to have this. We're just going to kind of pour into a new bottle, and there's going to be a new set of people with power with their own set of biases. I would invite maybe rethinking the inevitable relationship between power and marginalization to how can we structure power such that we can maybe institutionalize norms that work contrary to this marginalizing tendency that you all have identified. So France, for example, they have norms for sure that are being violated by what's happening. And I believe there are members of French society who are resisting what the government is doing, including those who are not themselves Islamic, who are not Muslim, traditional, the colonizers. The reason why they have such a high Muslim population, they colonize Muslim countries and That's what. But those who were on the colonizing side, they have internalized norms saying it's wrong. So hopefully, maybe it's possible that power doesn't have to yield these disgusting things that you guys have been talking about in all of your presentations. That there may be a way forward that people have just never figured out yet. But certainly the three presentations that you've offered to the viewers have given a lot to think about. And I believe that you've also helped open eyes that looking internationally and transnationally adds dimensions of understanding and perspective that is valuable, that there's a lot of commonalities across societies, bad as well as good. And I'd like to thank you all for doing such a fine job of presenting these ideas and practices with our viewing audience. And with that, I will say good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.